Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1, The Vanishing Train. Ethan adjusted his tie and checked his watch. It was nearing midnight, and the city's last train was due any moment. The station was eerily empty, its fluorescent lights flickering weakly. He sighed, the day's exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. As the train pulled in, its metallic screech echoed through the desolate platform. Ethan noticed something odd. This train seemed older, with rusted edges and faded insignias. Shrugging off the unease, he stepped inside. The train was unusually empty, save for a hooded figure seated at the far end. The figure sat unnaturally still, their face obscured by shadows. Ethan picked a seat near the middle and stared at his phone, trying to ignore the gnawing sensation that something wasn't right. The train lurched forward. As the city lights blurred outside, Ethan glanced out of the window. The familiar buildings and signs quickly gave way to unfamiliar landscapes, dense forests and abandoned structures. Middle Ethan's unease grew. He walked up to the train conductor's booth, but the door was locked, and no one responded to his knocks. Returning to his seat, he noticed the hooded figure was now seated closer to him. "Excuse me," Ethan called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they reached into their cloak and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Slowly, they placed it on the seat next to them before vanishing into the next car. Ethan hesitated but picked up the paper. It was a map of the train, though several areas were marked with strange symbols. One section marked exit was circled in red. Beside it were the words, "Reach before the final stop, or be lost forever." The lights flickered, and a sudden chill swept through the train. Ethan's breath came out in white puffs as he noticed something horrifying. The empty seats were now occupied by shadowy figures, their faces blank and featureless. He stumbled backward, clutching the map. The shadows turned their heads toward him in unison. "Find the exit," they whispered in a haunting chorus. Chase Ethan bolted into the next car, clutching the map tightly. The hooded figure was nowhere to be seen, but the whispers followed him. The map's markings didn't make sense. Every car he entered seemed identical. The same worn seats and flickering lights. He decided to focus on the symbols. One resembled a clock with a note beneath it. "Time is not on your side." Ethan checked his watch. It was stuck at midnight. Panic surged through him as he realized he might be trapped in a loop. In the next car, a loud clanging sound made him freeze. The shadows were no longer stationary. They moved slowly, methodically, filling the car behind him. Their blank faces were inches away, their whispers turning into guttural growls. Ethan ran. He reached a car that looked different. The seats were torn, and the windows were covered in a thick, unyielding fog. At the far end, a grandfather clock stood, its pendulum swinging erratically. "Time is not on your side," he muttered, recalling the map. The clock's hands were spinning backward. As he approached, the hooded figure reappeared. This time, they spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from every direction. "You've already wasted too much time." "Who are you?" Ethan demanded. "What is this place?" The figure didn't answer, but pointed to a small key dangling from the clock's pendulum. Ethan reached for it, but the shadows were closing in. He grabbed the key just as cold, clammy hands brushed against his back. Puzzled, Ethan stumbled into another car, slamming the door shut behind him. The key glinted in his hand, but he didn't know what it opened. The map showed another symbol, a spiral with the word reflection. He scanned the car and found a cracked mirror on the wall. As he approached, his reflection moved independently, mimicking his terror but not his movements. The reflection whispered, "The key unlocks your path, but it demands a sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Ethan shouted. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the map, which now had fresh bloodstains on it. The exit section glowed faintly. Ethan realized he had to solve the puzzle before the shadows reached him. He noticed a small keyhole at the base of the mirror's frame. Taking a deep breath, he inserted the key. The mirror shattered, revealing a hidden compartment with another map, more detailed than the first. The exit was closer than he thought, but the route was dangerous, marked with warnings like danger and do not stop. The final trial. As Ethan followed the new map, the train's environment grew increasingly bizarre. The cars seemed to elongate, the doors farther apart. Gravity shifted, making it difficult to walk. He reached a car filled with old luggage and personal items. One suitcase had his name on it. He opened it to find childhood photos, his first job ID, and a watch his late father had given him. "What is this?" he whispered. "These are your ties," said the hooded figure, appearing once more. "Your attachment to the world you knew. Leave them behind or you'll never leave." Ethan hesitated but realized he had no choice. He dropped the watch and closed the suitcase. The figure stepped aside, revealing a glowing red door. "This is your only chance." Ethan ran toward it, but the shadows surged forward, their guttural cries deafening. He reached the door just as cold hands grabbed his legs. Using all his strength, he turned the handle and fell through. The end. Ethan awoke on a cold platform, the sound of a distant train fading away. He was disoriented but alive. The platform was unfamiliar, surrounded by thick fog. A man in a station uniform approached him. "You're lucky," he said. "Lucky?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "What happened?" "That train hasn't run in decades," the man replied. "It vanished with all its passengers years ago. People say those who board it never come back." Ethan looked down and found a ticket in his pocket. The date matched the night he boarded the train. He stared at the empty tracks, the weight of his survival sinking in. The sound of a distant whistle made him shudder. He didn't wait to find out if the train would return. Story 2, The Whispering Woods, the beginning. Lila rolled her eyes at the warning given by the old man at the village inn. "Don't stay in the Whispering Woods past midnight," he had said in a trembling voice. "No one who hears the whispers ever comes out the same." Her friends, Jake, Sarah, and Tom, chuckled as they carried their camping gear into the dense forest. They had planned this trip for weeks. 4 friends looking for an adventure in the famed Whispering Woods, a place rumored to be haunted. "Ghost stories to keep tourists away," Jake said, laughing. The woods were beautiful during the day, sunlight filtering through the tall trees. Birds chirped, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. They found the perfect spot near a small clearing and set up their tents. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered around a crackling fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. At 11:30 p.m., the fire was dying, and the group was ready to call it a night. But just as Lila was zipping up her tent, she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Lila!" She froze, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" Jake said, poking his head out of his tent. "That whisper, it said my name." Jake smirked. "You're just spooked by that old man's story. Get some sleep." But the whisper came again, louder this time, carrying an eerie urgency. "Lila." The first encounter, Lila stepped out of her tent, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. "Hello," she called out. The whisper responded, now layered with multiple voices, like a chorus of shadows. "Follow us." Jake, Sarah, and Tom emerged from their tents, their faces pale. "Okay, I heard it that time," Tom admitted, gripping a flashlight tightly. "Maybe it's just the wind," Sarah suggested, though her voice wavered. "Wind doesn't say your name," Lila snapped. The whispers grew louder, circling them. The voices were now revealing secrets, personal and painful. "Jake, she never loved you." "Sarah, you've always been the second choice." "Tom, your father never forgave you." Group panicked. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, grabbing a map. But every path they took led them back to their campsite. "We're going in circles," Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "No," Lila said, her voice trembling. "The forest is keeping us here." The descent into madness hours passed, and the whispers became incessant, filling the air like a cacophony of despair. Each friend was unraveling under the pressure. Jake grew aggressive, accusing the others of sabotaging the trip. "You wanted this to happen. Admit it," he yelled, his face contorted with rage. Sarah withdrew, muttering to herself as the whispers fed her insecurities. "It's true, I'm worthless. I've always been worthless." Tom tried to keep the group together, but was visibly shaken. "We need to stay calm," he said, though his hands trembled violently. Lila noticed something strange. The whispers seemed to change based on their emotions. The angrier Jake became, the louder and more threatening the voices grew. When Sarah cried, the whispers softened, almost as if they were feeding off her despair. "We can't give in to them," Lila said, trying to steady her voice. "They're trying to break us." But the forest had other plans. The lost path. As dawn approached, the group stumbled upon an ancient stone circle covered in moss and strange carvings. Lila felt a chill as she touched one of the stones. It was ice cold, despite the warm night air. "This place feels wrong," Sarah whispered. The whispers intensified, urging them to enter the circle. "Come see the truth." Jake, now completely unhinged, stepped into the circle despite Lila's protests. "Maybe this is the way out," he shouted. The moment he crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. A deafening silence fell over the forest. Then Jake screamed, a sound so primal it sent shivers down Lila's spine. His body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. When he collapsed, he wasn't the same. His eyes were vacant, his voice monotone. "There is no escape," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The revelation terrified. The remaining three dragged Jake out of the circle and ran. They didn't stop until they reached a clearing. Jake's condition worsened. He whispered to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over, "The forest sees all." Lila studied the carvings on the map. She realized they matched the symbols on the stones in the circle. "This isn't just a forest, it's a trap," she said. "Those whispers, they're trying to claim us." "What do you mean, claim us?" Tom asked. "The forest preys on our fears and weaknesses. It won't let us leave until it has what it wants." "What does it want?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Lila didn't have an answer, but she knew they had to resist. The sacrifice, as night fell again, the whispers returned, louder and more relentless. Jake, now fully possessed, tried to lead them back to the stone circle. "It's the only way," he insisted, his voice dripping with malice. "No, it's not!" Lila shouted, pulling him back. The whispers began revealing Lila's secrets, her deepest regrets, her failures. She covered her ears, but it was no use. Tom, unable to take it anymore, broke down. "If this forest wants a victim, take me!" He screamed into the void. "No!" Lila cried, but it was too late. The whispers converged on Tom, their voices rising to a deafening roar. Tom looked at Lila, tears in his eyes. "Get out of here," he said before the shadows consumed him. The escape Lila and Sarah ran, Jake's possessed laughter echoing behind them. The forest seemed alive, the trees twisting and shifting to block their path. "Don't stop," Lila urged, dragging Sarah forward. The map began to glow faintly in Lila's hand, guiding them toward a faint light in the distance. "Lila," the whispers taunted, "you can't escape. You belong to us." But Lila refused to give in. She tightened her grip on Sarah's hand and pushed through the branches. Finally, they burst out of the forest and collapsed onto a dirt road. The whispers faded, replaced by the soft chirping of birds. The end. Lila and Sarah looked back at the forest, its dark silhouette ominous against the rising sun. Jake and Tom were gone, claimed by the woods. A group of villagers arrived, their faces somber. "You're the first to escape in years," one of them said. "What happened to the others?" Lila asked, her voice shaking. The villager pointed to the edge of the forest, where faint, shadowy figures could be seen among the trees. Lila recognized them, Jake and Tom. "They're part of the forest now," the villager said. "Once it claims you, it never lets go." Lila and Sarah left the village that day, vowing never to speak of the whispering woods again. But Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with her. Late at night, she could still hear the whispers. "Lila, come back." Story 3. The Locked Room. David stood in the grand foyer of the old mansion he had inherited from his late uncle, a man he barely remembered. The house was massive, with intricate woodwork, dusty chandeliers, and walls lined with faded portraits of stern-looking ancestors. The lawyer had handed him the keys with a cryptic warning: "Not all gifts are meant to be kept." David had brushed it off, eager to see the estate for himself. Exploring the house, he discovered a strange locked room on the second floor. Its heavy oak door was bound with iron chains, and a rusted padlock hung ominously from the handles. Curious, David searched the house for the key, but it was nowhere to be found. As he stood before the door, he felt a chill creep down his spine. The air near it was unnaturally cold, and faint, muffled cries seemed to emanate from within. "That's just the wind," he told himself, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trapped inside. The unlocking days turned into weeks, and the locked room consumed David's thoughts. The rest of the house was relatively normal, save for the occasional flicker of lights and the odd sensation of being watched. But the room seemed to breathe, its presence heavy and oppressive. One night, unable to sleep, David ventured into the attic. Among old trunks and cobwebbed furniture, he found a small, ornate box. Inside was a brass key, engraved with intricate patterns that matched the carvings on the locked door. His heart raced as he descended the stairs. He hesitated before the door, the key trembling in his hand. Logic told him to leave it alone, but curiosity had already won. As the key turned in the lock, a loud click echoed through the hallway. The chains fell away, clattering to the floor. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room that smelled of mildew and decay. Room's secret. The room was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the house. An antique mirror stood against one wall, its surface cloudy and cracked. In the center of the room was an old desk with a leather-bound journal resting on it. David picked up the journal, blowing off a layer of dust. The handwriting was neat but frantic, filled with warnings. "Do not open the door. The mirror is the key. Once seen, it cannot be unseen." A sudden chill made him look up. His reflection in the mirror wasn't matching his movements. David froze. While he held the journal, his reflection pointed toward the door and smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that sent shivers down his spine. "What the hell?" he whispered, stepping back. The door slammed shut behind him, and the room grew darker. The reflection began to move on its own, mimicking not his actions but his thoughts. "Don't be afraid. it said in a distorted version of his voice. The journal's warning frantic, David flipped through the journal. The entries spoke of his uncle's experiments, attempts to communicate with another realm through the mirror. The mirror shows more than just your reflection. It reveals your fears, your regrets, your darkest desires, but it also opens a door to them. The entries became more erratic. They come at night. They whisper my name. The mirror is cursed. I must contain it, or it will consume us all. David realized his uncle had locked the room to keep whatever was in the mirror contained. And now he had set it free. Reflection began to change, morphing into grotesque versions of David's face. One moment laughing maniacally, the next screaming in agony. The haunting begins. The whispers started that night. They seeped through the walls, growing louder each time David tried to sleep. The mirror, now moved to his bedroom without explanation, began showing visions, scenes from his past that he had tried to forget. His failed relationships, his regrets, his mistakes, all replayed in vivid detail. Worse, the reflections spoke to him, urging him to do things he would never consider. "You can fix everything," it whispered. "Just trust me." David tried covering the mirror, but the whispers continued. When he threw it out, it reappeared in its original place in the locked room. Descent into madness. Over the next few days, the house grew more malevolent. Lights flickered constantly, doors slammed on their own, and objects moved without explanation. David began hearing footsteps in the hallways, but when he checked, no one was there. The journal's final entry haunted him. The mirror feeds on despair. It will show you everything you've lost, everything you fear, until you have nothing left. Do not let it win. David tried to leave the mansion, but the moment he stepped outside, he found himself back in the foyer. The house wouldn't let him go. The confrontation desperate, David returned to the locked room, determined to destroy the mirror. He armed himself with a hammer and stormed inside. The reflection greeted him with a sinister smile. "You can't break me," it taunted. David swung the hammer with all his strength, shattering the mirror into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, he thought he had won. The shards began to move, each fragment reflecting a different version of himself, some weeping, others screaming, and a few glaring at him with pure hatred. The room filled with an otherworldly wind, and the shadows coalesced into a humanoid form. It spoke in a voice that sounded like countless whispers layered together. "You freed me." The final revelation. The entity revealed itself as a being bound to the mirror, trapped by David's uncle after one of his experiments went wrong. It had waited decades for someone foolish enough to open the door. "Why me?" David asked, backing away. "You carry pain," it replied. "Regret, weakness. I thrive on it." David realized the only way to defeat the entity was to deny it what it wanted. He had to confront his fears and regrets instead of letting them control him. Closed his eyes and focused, blocking out the whispers. He thought of his happiest memories, his mother's laughter, his childhood adventures, the people who had loved him. The entity screamed, its form flickering. "Stop!" it roared. But David didn't stop. He poured every ounce of hope and love he had into his thoughts. The room grew brighter, and the entity began to dissolve. The escape. When David opened his eyes, the room was empty. The mirror and the journal were gone, as if they had never existed. He left the mansion, the front door finally letting him pass. Outside, the sun was rising, casting warm light over the cold, eerie structure. David didn't look back. He sold the mansion the next day and moved far away, vowing never to let his curiosity get the better of him again. The end years later, David received a package with no return address. Inside was an ornate box. He didn't open it. Story 4. The Shadows of Raven Hollow. The beginning. Martha adjusted her scarf as she entered the quiet village of Raven Hollow. a secluded hamlet nestled deep in the woods. The air was thick with mist, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels. She had been assigned to document the folklore of the village for her anthropology thesis. The locals were known for their peculiar traditions and unsettling tales of the shadows. As she approached the inn, the villagers watched her with wary eyes, whispering to one another. Their faces were pale, and their expressions hinted at years of fear and suspicion. "You're here to study, are you?" asked the innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes. "Best you leave before sundown. That's when they come." "Who comes?" Martha asked, intrigued. The innkeeper didn't answer. She simply handed over the room key and muttered, "You'll find out if you're foolish enough to stay." The first night, Martha unpacked her bags and flipped through her notes. Whispers about the shadows piqued her interest. Her research had hinted at a local legend about spirits that roamed the village after dark, but details were sparse. Determined to learn more, she ventured into the village square. The locals avoided her questions, their responses curt and evasive. One old man finally muttered, "Stay inside after dusk. Bolt your doors. Don't answer if they call your name." The warning lingered in Martha's mind as she returned to the inn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, an oppressive silence blanketed the village. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir. Around midnight, Martha was jolted awake by a sound, a faint tapping on her window. She sat up, her heart racing. Tap, tap. Slowly, she approached the window and peeked through the curtains. A figure stood in the fog, its silhouette dark and featureless. It was motionless, yet she felt its gaze pierce through her. "Who's there?" she called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it vanished into the mist. The shadows appear. The next morning, Martha questioned the innkeeper about the figure she had seen. The woman's face turned pale. "You saw one of them," she whispered. "They're not alive, you know. They're what's left of those who broke the rules." "What rules?" Martha asked, her curiosity growing. "Never stay out after dark. Never speak to them. Never follow them." But why, and what were they? The innkeeper refused to say more, leaving Martha to piece together the mystery herself. That afternoon she visited the village archives in the town hall. There, she found references to a tragic event centuries ago, a fire that had consumed half the village. Many had perished, and the survivors claimed the spirits of the dead had never left. They became the shadows, cursed to wander Raven Hollow for eternity. The legend claimed they lured the living into the forest, where they were never seen again. The investigation determined to uncover the truth. Martha decided to test the legend. That night, she left the inn just as the sun set, armed with a flashlight and a notebook. She walked through the empty streets, the mist swirling around her feet. As the clock struck midnight, she heard it, a low whisper carried on the wind. "Martha," she froze, her breath hitching. The voice was soft yet chilling, like it was spoken directly into her ear. "Martha, come with us." The whisper grew louder, echoing all around her. Then she saw them, shadows slipping through the fog, their movements unnatural and jerky. They had no features, no faces, but she could feel their eyes on her. Panic gripped her, but she stood her ground, determined to document what was happening. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The shadows paused, and one stepped closer. Its shape began to shift, taking on a form that resembled her late mother. "Martha, it's me," the shadow said in her mother's voice. "Come with me. I've missed you." Tears filled Martha's eyes. "You're not real," she whispered, backing away. Shadow's form twisted, becoming monstrous. "You'll regret this," it hissed before disappearing into the mist. The trap shaken, Martha returned to the inn and locked herself in her room. She pored over her notes, trying to make sense of what she had seen. The shadows weren't just spirits. They were something far darker. They preyed on emotions, using memories and regrets to lure their victims. The next day, she spoke to the old man she had met earlier. He reluctantly told her of a place deep in the woods, a clearing known as the Hollow, where the shadows were strongest. "Why would anyone go there?" Martha asked. "They don't go willingly," the man replied. "The shadows call them, and they follow. If you go, you won't come back." Despite the warnings, Martha decided to visit the Hollow. She had to see it for herself. The journey to the Hollow. As the sun set, Martha ventured into the forest, following the faint whispers that seemed to guide her. Trees grew denser, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. After hours of walking, she reached the clearing. The air was icy cold, and the ground was littered with blackened skeletal remains of trees. In the center stood a large stone altar, covered in strange glowing symbols. The whispers grew louder, forming words, "Welcome, Martha." She felt a presence behind her, and turned to see the shadows gathering, their forms blending into one massive shifting entity. It spoke in a chorus of voices, each one dripping with malice. "You're here because you're curious," it said. "Stay, and we'll show you everything." In the encounter, Martha felt an overwhelming pull toward the altar. Her mind was filled with visions, her happiest memories twisted into nightmares. The shadows were trying to break her. "You think you're brave," the entity hissed, "but you're just like the others. Weak." Martha gritted her teeth, fighting back the fear. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice wavered. The entity laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. "Everyone is afraid of the truth," it said. "Look into the altar and see what you really are." Despite her better judgment, Martha approached the altar. The symbols pulsed with an unnatural light, and as she peered into its surface, she saw herself, but not as she was. She saw her regrets, her mistakes, and her flaws magnified. The shadows were showing her everything she hated about herself. "No," she said, stepping back. "This isn't real." "Isn't it?" the entity taunted. The escape Martha realized the only way to defeat the shadows was to reject their power over her. They thrived on fear and doubt, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "I made mistakes," she said aloud, her voice steady, "but I'm more than my regrets. You have no power over me." The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering. The whispers turned into screams as the clearing began to collapse, the altar crumbling into dust. Martha ran, the forest closing in around her. The path seemed endless, but she refused to stop. Finally, she broke through the tree line and stumbled into the village square. The first rays of dawn lit the sky, and the whispers were gone. The aftermath. The villagers were stunned to see her alive. No one who had entered the Hollow had ever returned. "You survived," the innkeeper said, her voice filled with awe. "How?" "I didn't let them win," Martha replied simply. She left Raven Hollow that morning, her research complete. But the experience left her changed. She couldn't forget the shadows, their whispers, or the truth they had tried to show her. Years later, Martha published her findings, warning others about the dangers of Raven Hollow. But deep down, she knew the shadows were still there, waiting for their next victim. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she swore she could still hear them calling her name. Story 5. The Cursed Lighthouse. The night was stormy when Ethan arrived at the desolate island where Blackthorn Lighthouse stood. The wind howled, and the waves crashed violently against the jagged rocks. The lighthouse, perched precariously on the cliff's edge, was a foreboding structure that seemed to loom over the entire island like a silent sentinel. Ethan was no stranger to danger. As a marine historian, he had explored countless abandoned ships, sunken treasures, and forgotten structures. But Blackthorn Lighthouse was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. or so the locals in the nearby coastal town believed. Stay away from the light, an old fisherman had warned him before he boarded the small boat. It doesn't guide, it consumes. Ethan dismissed the warning as local superstition. He was here to investigate the mysterious disappearances of several lighthouse keepers over the past century, which had vanished without a trace, their belongings left untouched, and the light of the tower always burning as if it had a will of its own. The discovery of the logbook. The inside of the lighthouse was damp and decrepit. The walls were streaked with salt, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. Ethan's flashlight illuminated the spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room. Dust motes danced in the beam as he climbed, the creaking of the metal steps echoing through the hollow structure. At the top, he found the keeper's quarters, a small room with a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. On the desk lay a leather-bound logbook. Ethan opened it, the pages brittle with age. The entries were written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The light, it's alive. I hear whispers in the wind. They call my name. Don't look into the light. It shows you things you cannot unsee. The last entry was dated over 50 years ago. It read simply, I can't resist anymore. It's calling me. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He closed the logbook and looked toward the lantern room. The glass panels of the massive Fresnel lens sparkled, even though the light was extinguished. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the room in brief, blinding flashes. The lantern room, Ethan climbed the final steps to the lantern room. The Fresnel lens stood in the center, a magnificent piece of engineering, but there was something unsettling about it. The way it reflected the lightning made it seem alive, as if it were watching him. He reached out to touch the lens, but stopped short when he noticed something strange. The surface wasn't just glass. It was covered in faint etchings, symbols he didn't recognize. They seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if they were breathing. "What is this?" he muttered, running his fingers over the engravings. The moment he did, a sharp pain shot through his hand, and he pulled back. His palm was bleeding, the cut precise and clean, as if the lens had sliced him deliberately. As he wrapped his hand in a cloth, a sound broke through the storm, a low, mournful hum that seemed to emanate from the lens itself. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic, alive. The whispers began. Ethan decided to leave the lantern room and return to the quarters. But as he descended the stairs, he heard whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, insistent. Ethan, he froze, gripping the handrail. The voice was soft, almost seductive, and distinctly female. It called his name again, drawing him back toward the light. Shaking his head, he pressed on, his boots clanging against the metal steps. Back in the keeper's quarters, he tried to distract himself by examining the books on the shelf. Most were maritime guides and navigation manuals, but one caught his attention. It was a leather-bound tome with no title. Inside, the book was filled with more of the strange symbols etched on the lens. There were also diagrams of the lighthouse and accounts of rituals performed within its walls. The final pages described a binding ceremony meant to trap something within the light. Ethan felt a wave of nausea. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon, it was a prison. The vision night fell and the storm raged on. Ethan tried to sleep, but the whispers wouldn't let him. They grew louder, more persistent. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were vivid and terrifying. He was standing on the cliff, staring into the lighthouse beam. Instead of illuminating the sea, the light revealed something else. A vast, swirling void filled with writhing shapes. He saw faces in the darkness, their mouths open in silent screams. The beam turned toward him, and the shapes surged forward, consuming everything in their path. Ethan woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The whispers were now deafening, a cacophony of voices all calling his name. The descent into madness. Unable to resist any longer, Ethan climbed back to the lantern room. The light was on now, even though he hadn't activated it. The beam rotated slowly, illuminating the stormy sea outside. As he approached the lens, he saw his reflection. But it wasn't him, not entirely. His reflection smirked, its eyes dark and empty. "Welcome," it said. "You've been chosen." Ethan staggered back, his heart pounding. The whispers merged into a single voice, deep and resonant, coming from the light itself. "You cannot escape. You are mine now." Desperate, Ethan tried to smash the lens, but the moment his hammer struck it, he was thrown backward by an invisible force. The room filled with blinding light, and Ethan felt himself being pulled toward the lens, as if the light had become a vortex. The truth revealed. In a flash, Ethan was no longer in the lighthouse. He was in the void he had seen in his dream, surrounded by the writhing shapes. They were souls, hundreds, maybe thousands, trapped and tormented, their faces frozen in eternal anguish. The voice spoke again, this time all around him. "I am the beacon. I guide the lost, the damned. And now you are one of them." Ethan realized the lighthouse wasn't a prison for the entity. It was a lure, a way to draw people to their doom. The keepers hadn't disappeared. They had been consumed, their souls bound to the light. He tried to fight, to resist, but the void was relentless. His memories, his fears, his regrets, they were all laid bare, feeding the entity's power. The final stand, Ethan refused to give up. He focused on the symbols he had seen in the book, recalling the binding ritual. Summoning all his strength, he recited the words, his voice trembling but resolute. The void trembled, and the light flickered. The entity screamed, a sound that reverberated through Ethan's very soul. "You dare defy me," it roared. The symbols on the lens glowed brighter, and the vortex began to collapse. Ethan felt himself being pulled back, the writhing shapes clawing at him as he escaped their grasp. Aftermath. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of the lantern room. The light was off, and the storm had passed. The lighthouse was eerily silent. He stumbled down the stairs, clutching the logbook and the tome. As he reached the base of the tower, he looked back one last time. The lighthouse stood still and dark, its curse seemingly broken. Ethan left the island that morning, determined to destroy the books and ensure no one else fell victim to the light. But as he boarded the boat, he noticed something strange. The lighthouse beam flickered once, then went dark. And in the back of his mind, he swore he heard the whispers start again.